So yes, this book is a personal project. It blends biography and some memoir, and it's a work of art history. It's a joint biography of two visual artists, Andrew Topolsky and Cindy Suffoletto, who were my aunt and uncle, and who passed away when I was a teenager. Andy died in 2008, and Cindy in 2012. I started writing about them in large part because I wanted to understand their lives as artists. They were a little bit mysterious because they came from Buffalo, like me, but they moved to New York City with a whole sort of generation of artists from Buffalo to chase bigger opportunities there. This would have been in the mid-'70s to the early '80s. So we didn't see them as much as we saw some other family members, and I sort of knew of them as artists as a kid, but I didn't know exactly what that meant. So then when I was an adult in their absence, getting interested in the visual art, getting interested in poetry and publishing and part of their world, I always wondered what they would be saying to me if they were still around to see me going through all that. I thought about, before I got here, bringing this book to this place, because while this is a biography of two people, really a biography of a marriage, it's also a book about intellectual, creative, and spiritual communities. And so I was really looking forward to this because, of course, this is an intellectual, creative, and spiritual community. I thought a lot about those communities and what that means as I wrote this book. Some of these communities in the arts have a name, like the Monteagle Sunday School Assembly, or, for example, like the agrarians who call this place home. Some of these communities have names, but we disagree about what they mean, like the Beats, the Beat Generation, or the New York School of Poets and Painters. Those are still debated. But there are also creative and intellectual communities that are never named, because they might exist in a backyard in Buffalo, New York, or someone's porch here at Monteagle. And they're just as important and real as the ones that do have names. But maybe there aren't books and documentaries written about them, so that's partly why I wanted to write this. I'm going to read a couple sections from this book and then try to bridge the gaps in between, and then I think we'll have a good amount of time afterwards if you have any questions. I first want to introduce you to the characters. The book opens with Andy and Cindy in a scene late in their marriage, late in Andy's life, about a month before he died. This would have been in January of 2008. She lets him help her move the armchair from its spot against the pale plaster wall. Really, Cindy does the lifting, tugging, stutter-stepping to clear a space. Opposite, the upholstery sags, straining beneath his fingers. When she moves to lift the framed drawing from the wall, then inch out the nail that held it, he rests, laying his palms flat against the chair's faded arms. Still and splayed like this, his hands look white, like enormous summer moths. 4 months ago, Andy had been built like a laborer, eating well and breathing mountain air, putting in shifts at his studio beside their home in Callicoon, a hamlet tucked in the Catskills. He lifted bricks and stones for sculptures, practiced joinery with heavy beams meant for dining sets that friends and neighbors had commissioned. But now, back in the city for appointments with specialists, stairs dizzy him. Elevators give him vertigo. Small talk leaves him breathless. Budweiser still sits well, but even simple foods, favorite foods, can make him nauseous. Cindy manages. She manages the double-mortgaged house in Callicoon, the dark rented apartment on Withers Street in North Williamsburg. She manages the correspondence, friends checking in galleries from Buffalo to Basel inquiring. And she manages the hospitals. With weathered eyes and wiry hair from her own second round of chemo completed in the fall, Cindy knows the hospitals, knows the right people at Herbert Irving and Weill Cornell and Columbia. She knows all the sallow hallways, the exits, and the dead ends. For 20 years, Cindy has managed for both of them. She has managed Andy and Andy's career. the recognition received for his beautiful, precise, complicated, recognize-it-anywhere art. She took pride in it until, one day, pride was an indulgence that exhaustion wouldn't afford her. And now this. Now Andy needs her more than ever, and in new, rewardless ways. They are alone in love and knowledge of each other. Cindy manages because she must for the both of them. But with them, it has never been just about surviving. They learned to be alone together first inside ideas. The purple t-shirt hangs loosely from Andy's shoulders. His shrinking body is a factory of bones, new protuberances emerging from him every day. His own unfamiliarity makes the shirt difficult to remove. Cindy steps to him, her small hands finding the hem hanging blousily where his stomach used to be. He looks away as she lifts, letting his arms drop and loping to the tripod as soon as he's free. He fiddles with the camera, an old Polaroid, the same one that has been with him all these years. Funny. He earned his MFA in photography and came up in the world with a group the critics called the Fixtures generation. He had been a leader among them, the far-out one, the star to catch, once. But when the coffee table books were finally written, Andy was relegated to the appendix. The reason was simple. Andy stopped making pictures. For a period of years, he stopped making art altogether. But now pictures are all he can talk about. The surface, Andy says, speaking to himself, staring through the viewfinder to the open wall. A loaded gun. When he sways, it feels like the room moves with him. She thinks he's paler than the walls. Under the brutal shop lamp, his bruises glow like bar signs. Outside, snow falls, and music fills the street when a car door opens. No one. Alicia Keys, one of the first hits of the new year. Cindy starts to hum along, but as soon as she begins, the song is gone. A little more, Andy says, his rumble now a rasp. Cindy tugs the chair, another inch, then straightens up. Still bare from the hips, holding his waistband with one hooked hand, he shuffles into the light. Cindy sees it now, where the blank wall ends and the canvas begins. When he turns, he doesn't look into the camera. He looks to her. Their eyes shine like a river in the moonlight. Wait, he says, straightens his body to the camera. It is a minor struggle even to lift his own chin, to face, in a way, his own gaze. The cheeks behind his beard slacken, eyes go hard. Maybe this is it. The voice, his or hers, is lost inside the click. So that's the opening of the book, and I wanted to start at the end of their life together, in part because their marriage was a marriage of two artists, and the book explores what exactly that means, the sacrifices involved, the particular type of intimacy I think that two artists can have in that kind of relationship. Both of them stopped making art at various points in their lives, but the fact that they came back to it at the end, I thought, said so much about them. I want to go back to the beginning of their story, though, which took place in Buffalo, New York. Believe it or not, Buffalo has a little more going for it than chicken wings and occasional Super Bowl runs by the Bills. At one point, roughly between 1962 and 1982, the avant-garde in every discipline and every field was happening in Buffalo. All at the same time, in that 20-year period, you had the philosophers Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida teaching at the university together. You had composers like John Cage and his collaborator Merce Cunningham. You had the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo amassing what would eventually become the largest collection of the art of the 50s and 60s, mostly in the New York School and Neo-Expressionism. So much so that some of those artists from that generation, like Clifford Still and Marisol, would donate their entire estates to the museum because they wanted to be in that context. Poetry and literature, too. You had Robert Creeley and Charles Olson teaching at UB at the same time and giving readings at corner bars. And in that mix, a younger generation was coming up. That was one that Andy and Cindy were part of. Probably the most famous people from that generation were Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman. Assume a few folks are familiar with those names. They came up in Buffalo and started a gallery called Hall Walls. And I've discovered that the first Hall Walls show featured Robert Longo and my uncle Andy Topolsky. Some of the people from that scene went on to fame and wealth and everything else, and others to relative obscurity. I thought a lot about what the difference is, I guess, between that kind of Cindy Sherman level success in the arts and what people like Andy Topolsky and Cindy Cefaletto experienced, in part because Andy exhibited on every inhabited continent. He had shows from Japan to Argentina. He's in major collections in most cities in the US, but I would assume that most people here, before hearing about this book, didn't know his name. So I wanted to dig into why exactly that happens. Are folks here familiar with Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat? A few. So he's one of those artists, like Cindy Sherman or an Andy Warhol, who did achieve sort of celebrity status. And he's in this book too. So I'm going to take you to Manhattan in 1982. And I'll just say by way of introduction, there's another character in this book that you won't know. His name is Bob Gully. He's an artist as well who came out of that same Buffalo scene and moved to New York around the same time. He slips into the freight elevator just before the doors thud shut. Tall, 6 feet, with a stiff spray of hair adding another 5 inches, he ducks his head, even though the elevator is 8 feet high. "Sorry," he says. "I forgot I pressed the button. I forgot I was going anywhere." Bob Gully recognizes him, recognizes the voice, sometimes sure and sometimes hesitant, almost always gentle, curving off the soft palate. The year is 1982. Jean-Michel Basquiat is 22 years old. He'd been watching MASH while Bob was stalking the jungles of Vietnam. By 1979, a high school dropout, Basquiat was a fixture on the underground scene. A mixture of punk, noise, poetry, filmmaking, and visual artists, spanning the pictures generation, the new painting, and pop's old guard. Earlier that year, before he moved into the second-floor loft at 101 Crosby Street on the northeastern edge of Soho, he had his first solo show at the Anina Nosei Gallery. The freight elevator is busier these days, a steady traffic of gallerists, collectors, writers, documentarians, and hangers-on. "Hey, you're Bob, right?" he asks. Bob Gully looks up, gaze breaking from the pane of air before the sliding doors, where he thought he'd rest politely for the duration of the short trip down. "Yeah, Bob," he says, "that's me." "I like your work, Bob," Jean-Michel says. I hit the wrong button a few times." At 101 Crosby, popular with artists, the freight elevator opens directly into the living spaces on each floor. It isn't quite like the heady crush of Essex Street a few years earlier. That was where the Hall Wall scene started in Buffalo. But still, punch the wrong floor or stop on your way down to pick up another passenger, and you get a good sense of what your neighbors are up to. The doors slide open. Bob waits for Jean-Michel to take the first step out, but he doesn't. Instead, he says, "Hey, I like your rifles." So like I said, Bob was in Vietnam. He was, at this point, making these sculptures of rifles that turned into different objects. "Thanks," Bob says. I appreciate that." 7 minutes later, the doors slide open again onto the second-floor loft. Bob, carrying a sculpture of a broom turning into a rifle, or a rifle into a broom, takes a long gulp of the scene around him, trying to retain the full sweep of it before he succumbs to the distraction of the details. There is a TV and a VHS player, video cassettes of TV shows and movies stacked beside it, and a single chair in front of the screen, uncomfortably close. There is a clarinet leaning in a corner. There are piles of crumpled silk and wool, suits by the look of it, and expensive. There are cans of spray paint, oil paint sticks, and buckets of bright acrylics. A mattress floats somewhere like a piece of a shipwreck. Along the wall closest to the elevator are 3 stretched white canvases, or what appear to be white canvases. A few steps farther into the apartment, Bob realizes these are works painted over in thick coats of white. Traces of past lives, discarded ideas yearn toward the surface of each. And everywhere, really everywhere, are Basquiat's paintings, finished works and canvases not yet abandoned. Figures regal, threatening, mischievous, mysterious, tumble toward him from every direction. There is a city in primary colors, school buses and skyscrapers, and snakes and guts and swords and bones, cartoon dinosaurs with crowns, and a cacophony of language, words like head and thread and stop and gold and tar, all shouting at once to be heard. The work is good, Bob can see, very good. It's energetic, assertive, new, and very much of the city, just now reclaiming itself from a decade of smoke and slumber. But it is also technically good, with an infallible sense of line and a deceptively delicate attention to composition. You like it? Jean-Michel emerges from the kitchen, or what might have been his kitchen. The furniture is sparse, and the walls are paint-splattered and densely figured, making it hard to tell where the artwork ends and the floor plan begins. I love it. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Jean-Michel's eyes drop to the sculpture in Bob's left hand. That's it, he says. That's the one I saw. Well, says Bob, you can have it. He holds it out diagonally with both hands, just like they taught him in the army. Jean-Michel accepts it in the same fashion. I can give you some work, he says. He frees a hand to gesture to the floor, where studies and oil sticks are spread out like a windswept game of solitaire. Then Jean-Michel looks again at his neighbor. He notices the serious boots, steel-toed, and the hammer loop in his cargo pants. That was sawdust he smelled on Bob, and he remembers the rumble in the elevator that didn't come from the machinery. How much would this go for at a gallery, do you think, he asks, holding up the sculpture. Come on, tell me. I guess if I was lucky, maybe 500, Bob says. Jean-Michel thinks a beat. I know a bargain, he says, beaming. I'll take it. So this actually happened. And for those of you who are familiar with Basquiat's work, what he offered this guy, Bob Gully, in 1982 today probably would be worth a couple $1 million. But Jean-Michel was a sensitive guy, and he recognized that Bob needed to pay rent that month. While Jean-Michel was just beginning to take off, and he would be dead 6 years later, Bob Gully was still working as a construction worker in Manhattan. And he would do that all the way up until he was in his 70s. I tracked him down just outside of Chicago, where he's still making art, he's retired, he's still exhibiting. And he told me the story about the time that he passed up getting an original Basquiat from Basquiat in exchange for his own art. And I thought that little interaction just perfectly captures the divergent futures, divergent fates, let's say, that artists can have, who are all milling about in the same scene, all making work, often all making really, really good work. But sort of mysterious factors pull different ones in different directions. Again, I want to come back to this idea of artistic community, because Andy and Cindy moved through many of them. I mentioned the Hall Walls one, but there was also a community around them in Williamsburg, in New York, and then ultimately they moved to a place not unlike this one, in New York State, about 2.5 hours outside of New York. It was up in the mountains in the Catskills. It was remote. And I found the more I looked into their life and the lives of artists like them, that if you last long enough in the arts, eventually New York and Los Angeles are not going to be kind to you, unless you really, really made it into the stratosphere. Eventually, to keep making art, which is why you got into this in the first place, you often have to retreat to somewhere that doesn't make the same kinds of demands on you. And that's ultimately what they did. I should also mention, while Andy Topolsky did achieve pretty great success in his lifetime, his wife Cindy also exhibited in Buffalo and even over in Germany, but she stopped making art around 1993 to support Andy's career, which is something that happened all too often with that generation of artists and the artists before. You look at somebody like Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, his wife. They had a similar experience where Lee was a well-known artist before Jackson Pollock was anybody. But then once they got together, she sort of took a step back to support him. and she was only able to reemerge after he died. My Aunt Cindy had a similar experience, but her own life was too short for her to do much with the work she was making at the end of her life. So I want to take you to that place where they spent their last years, Callicoon, New York. There we go. So, and again, coming back to the idea of community. Toward the end of the book, I realized this. Artistic communities are simply this. The people whose ideas and whose love contextualize your work, your identity, the innumerable futures that radiate ahead of you. I've been lucky to collide with a few people very dear to me who, individually, have always been ready with a candle and a little conversation when I needed it. But I have never experienced the sort of artistic communities that Andy and Cindy created and fostered repeatedly in Buffalo, in Brooklyn, and in Callicoon. Deciding shortly after Andy's death that I would be a writer, I passed through my teens and 20s seeking the comfort of a context. Growing up in Buffalo, this has meant a tendency to reach for an idealized past. Every generation feels like it just missed something wonderful. Bob Gully, then 73, whispered to me over the phone. I had been asking him about his decision to leave Buffalo for Greenwich Village. For me, it was the Hallwall scene, he said. Cindy Sherbin and Robert Longo had just left by the time I got there. I understood that. I caught the tail end of the 464 crowd, missed the City of Night era at the Silos, and lasted through a few sun flares in the Buffalo poetry scene. In 2015 and 2016, after I returned to Buffalo from a year in Europe, a few friends and I even decided to assert our own vision of artistic practice and community in Buffalo with a little magazine we called Foundlings, which interspersed approachable poetry and cheekily collaged text and images we found and fancied. But still, like so many others, I couldn't help reaching further back to when Robert Creeley read poetry at the Essex Street Pub, or Charlie Parker played the Colored Musicians Club. For my entire life, though, that searching nostalgia has been layered with the keener ache of Andy and Cindy's absence. I built and lit the fire the last time we visited the house on Seminary Road in Callicoon, July 31st, 2012. I built it in the morning, a mug of black coffee waiting on a stump behind me. On the weekend that we would have been celebrating Cindy's 50th birthday, 3 months after we had buried her, and only 1 month after we had interred her brother Dave, my parents, my grandparents, and Uncle Tom and Aunt Barbie worked in the house, dismantling every room, loading furniture into Tom's pickup truck and my dad's black Toyota Highlander, putting pictures and knickknacks into boxes. For 2 days, I fed the fire with paper, junk mail, magazines, empty notebooks, and boxes of tax returns and documents from Cindy's work as an accountant and bookkeeper. In the back, the fire had swollen into an enormous tumulus of black and gray ash, 3 feet high, which belied an inner furnace that burned through the weekend. Elsewhere in the house, my family was beginning to unravel. And in the attic, stuffing books and CDs into a duffel, I was beginning to perceive the terrifying dimensions of a too early end. With Andy's passing in 2008 and Cindy's death 4 years later, I hadn't just lost a beloved aunt and uncle, 2 people who'd always doted on and taken an interest in me, even from a distance. They had loved me as a nephew and a godson, a child. But I was beginning to become something like a real human being, one really engaging with art for the first time, encountering politics that happened at home and not just on Meet the Press, committing to using writing as a way not only of expressing myself in the world, but of keeping alive an internal revolution of new ideas displacing old. At the close of the last long weekend at the house on Seminary Road, as I used a shovel to spread the warm ashes of a lifetime of incident over the fire pit, I felt something that I couldn't then articulate. It was this. that the intractable difficulty of loss doesn't lie in retrospect, in remembering the departed, but in a perpetual and evolving present. Not in remembering, but in imagining each new iteration of a relationship that will never materialize, a relationship arrested in the receding past. At 19, at 21, at 30, what matters most isn't that I lost an aunt and uncle. It's that I lost two people who could have become some of my closest friends. Something of me ended there in that could have become. A place totally frozen, at a distance clouded over but close up cross-hatched with bonded hexagons in an infinite static lattice. Something of me ended there, with them, but did not die. That's all I had planned to read. I realize I finished a little quickly, but we also could have a conversation here if anybody has questions there. This book goes to all kinds of places, so if you're interested in that Buffalo scene of the 70s or New York, Soho, Williamsburg, and the cutthroat 80s, we can talk about any of that too. So, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Could you explain a little more about the Buffalo scene?
Yeah, sure. So, where do I begin here? The Buffalo scene, I said that it was bookended, 1962 to 1982. Growing up in Buffalo, I heard bits and pieces about this legendary past. I mean, and Buffalo is one of these cities, right? I was just a little kid when the Buffalo Bills went on their 4 doomed Super Bowl runs. But Buffalo, I also grew up in a city of maybe 250,000 people, and at the peak of Buffalo's population, it was 600,000 people. So we were almost like a hermit crab in a shell that was just way too big. The city is built for a larger population than we currently have. When I would drive from my home in North Buffalo downtown, I would go down Delaware Avenue, past a mile of the most opulent mansions I'd seen anywhere, and I mean even to this day, anywhere I've seen. Buffalo at one point had more millionaires per capita than any city in the world. So it's a place of sort of like dusky glories in the past that, you know, when I was born, when I grew up, was really at its low point. We lost over half our population, the economy had cratered, nothing worked. We have this silly little subway system that goes for about 1 mile in just one direction, and no one uses it. It's kind of an absurd place, but you're always aware of this legendary past. So I tried to trace a couple of the threads of things that I was aware of, and came away with a picture that was pretty extraordinary. Again, I threw out a lot of the names of some of the more famous people who were in town at that time, but I could go on much longer. It really was like everybody who was anybody in any particular discipline, if they didn't live in Buffalo, they were at least visiting often, and they left an impression on the city. Well, how did that happen? It happened because of a lot of money flowing into the city at that time from the state. So 1962, Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York, and there was a movement of I guess what are called the Rockefeller Republicans, where they controlled the governorship and the state, assembly and senate, and they were interested in art in a different way. A lot of them were, patrons of art, or their parents were patrons of art. So they started splashing out public funding to support the arts, and that drew people to places that knew how to take the best advantage of that. And Buffalo was absolutely that. There was a sort of dynamic leader of the university there. There was a dynamic leader of the symphony, and they recognized that they had access to this state funding. They might not have it forever, and so they started recruiting. And they would bring the brightest minds from Europe over, whether to conduct the symphony or to teach philosophy in the school. And that lasted, as I said, for about 20 years. And as soon as the money spigot turned off in Albany, everybody left, or roughly like half a generation left. And that's because, endowed professorships are nice, but there wasn't a population of art collectors there that was big enough to support that many people, that number of people who'd been recruited. So then they all started to flow away. However, they left an incredible legacy in Buffalo, an impression on the kind of creative and intellectual character of the city. And I think it's also misleading or a lie to say that everybody left. I know I just said that, but I want to correct myself. Because there were a bunch of incredible artists who did stay, who hung on, and who maybe never found fame and fortune like Cindy Sherman and Longo and others, but did make incredible work, and it's still out there to be found. Yeah.
And talk about leading up to the Rockefeller funding. The Buffalo was a city of collectors, and I guess surprising to me when I read the book, pushing the envelope on those new collections. And as we were talking, it's one phone call away from being what New York City was to the avant-garde movement. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I did in the book have to go further back than 1962 because, okay, there's a lot of state funding available, but how is it that there were enough people in Buffalo who were, primed and ready and sort of keyed into the avant-garde, whether it be in visual arts or poetry, to be able to take advantage of that? Well, it goes back, I think, to the beginning of the 20th century. As Mark said, there were some collectors in the kind of last couple generations of the Buffalo aristocracy that largely, fell apart, who I think probably because of World War I had some exposure to modernism in Europe. So there was a collector named Anson Conjure Goodyear, who went and served in World War I, and then he, found out about Picasso, and he found out about all of these movements happening in Europe, and he went to a show in New York City in, I think, 1916 called the Armory Show, which was the moment where America was introduced to European modernism. And then he took that back to Buffalo and used his personal fortune to start buying it. However, Buffalo can be a bit of a conservative town, even to this day. There have been many controversies over our history where artists push the envelope a little too far, and this was one of them. At the time, I mentioned the Albright Knox Art Gallery, which is now it's called the AKG. At the time, it was just called the Albright Art Gallery, and they had a very traditional collection. It wasn't that exciting. There were lots of copies of old masters, copies of statues, things like that. And Anson started buying up Picassos, and he started buying up all sorts of Brancusi and Rodin and things like that. And his parents' generation sort of put up with it for a little while, but then he bought this one Picasso painting called La Toilette, which is it's a painting of a nude woman in a mirror sort of tying up her hair. And in Buffalo in 1920, this was just too far. And a lot of people got very upset by this. They said, you know what, we're cutting this guy off. And there was a quiet campaign, largely waged in the private social clubs in Buffalo, to block his nomination as president of the art gallery, which would have allowed him to do whatever he wanted. And that was successful. He was so upset by this campaign to oust him that he said, screw it, I'm going to New York and taking my money with me. He lands in New York, and within a week, he meets Mrs. Rockefeller, who at that time was working with some of her friends on a similar vision to Goodyear's. They wanted to create the definitive museum for modernism in America. Today, we would call that the Museum of Modern Art. The founding collection that got the Museum of Modern Art started was Anson Conjure Goodyear's. It was a collection that he had bequeathed to the museum in Buffalo, but that they rejected. So MoMA could have been in Buffalo, if not for, as I said, a quiet campaign in smoke-filled rooms. Yeah.
So can you give us a little color on why there is a metro system that's 1 mile long that goes one direction? Is that a similar story?
Yeah, gosh, I wish I knew an answer to that. It probably also could take up an entire book. Buffalo has a way of just kind of stumbling through the most basic sort of municipal projects like that. I really don't know why we built the subway for 1 mile. We had this incredible Art Deco train station that still exists today but is empty, and we simply could have connected downtown to that train station on the existing rail and then brought it all the way to the airport so that people could get to the airport from downtown without driving. And we didn't do that. Instead, we put it right down the middle of Main Street in Buffalo so that no one could drive or walk on Main Street. And then slowly it all emptied out. we also, I mentioned the beautiful mansions on Delaware Avenue. They're really worth seeing. They're pretty extraordinary. But we also destroyed a lot of our architectural treasures. We had a ton of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. If anybody's a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright, some gems are still in Buffalo. One is open to the public, two are in private hands. But we also had much more, including what the Larkin Soap Company had their headquarters there, and it was a monumental work with, really innovative way that he laid out the main office, and we knocked it down. And nothing is in its place to this day. And I could go on and on and on. Most of our architectural treasures we destroyed, so we have that habit too. Sometimes to build subways that go nowhere. We had some incredible 19th century architecture downtown, and we knocked it all down to put in a convention center that eliminates like 2 city blocks and has no windows, and so there's nothing street facing, no one wants to walk there. What are you going to do? Yes?
The other thing, I've always, I know you probably grew up knowing your aunt and uncle could work and the finished product and seeing it. What fascinates me is always the process to get to that work. What did you discover about their artistic process or the artistic process itself that led to the works that you were familiar with? Were you surprised by it? Did it seem familiar to you? Was it, did it evolve? Was it confrontational? Living with 2 artists, it's got to be like living with 2 lawyers. I mean, there's got to be great collaboration, great conflicts at various times. What are the things that you discovered that led to the art that you were familiar with, but gave it more meaning?
Yeah, I love that question, and I think you also hit on one of the most important things, which is the collaborative aspect of it. Even though these artists were in my family, their works hung on the walls of my parents' home, my grandparents' home, I still encounter those works as finished products. And as a kid, I just didn't have the tools, I guess, to talk with them about what it was like to make that art. I also have no visual skills whatsoever. I can't even hang a picture straight, let alone make one. So that wasn't happening. But when I got to research them, not approaching them as a nephew or their godson, but as a journalist and biographer, I learned a lot more about their process. And I should also say, I'm sorry I don't have slides up, but if you want to see the work, the short documentary playing later tonight has tons of great images of both of their work. Andy, you mentioned process. In some ways, Andy took that to an extreme. Andy's work he called intermedia, which was a term associated with a movement called Fluxus, which saw the making of art as a continuous process really for one's whole life. So his works on paper, he would use graphite and typeset and different things. He would then sometimes draw in pencil on his own, what looked like completed work. Many of them looked like the designs for sinister machines. He would sometimes use geometry or mathematics to plot out material onto paper, and it looked like blueprints for buildings or, as I said, sinister nuclear devices, let's say. But then he also was a sculptor, and in some cases, he literally did sculpt things that he had first designed on paper. And then he took that even further. Probably the most extreme example I heard of was that one time on the drive back from Buffalo to New York City, and actually I'm going to take a detour there in a moment. I want to come back to why he was driving instead of flying. He wrote a poem in his head, and then he wrote that down when he got home, and then he used a mathematical formula to erase parts of the poem, which is a common sort of language game, poetic technique, erasure poems, where you make something new just by eliminating words. So he did that. He then plotted that onto paper using another mathematical formula, and then he came up with a way for that geometrical shape that he had taken from a poem again and plotted onto the paper to be played as a musical score. And then he hung that in a gallery, and he brought in this orchestra to play his paintings as music. So everything was a progression for him, all the way to the end of his life. He did take a bit of a break, and after 9/11, he was deeply affected by that. He was there and witnessed it, and so he stopped working for about a year. And he came back later, and you could see where he picked up some of the old ideas with a new attitude. Cindy's work maybe wasn't so experimental in an intermediate way. She wasn't creating works on paper that were meant to be played as music, but she was also experimenting with new technologies and things. As I mentioned, she stopped making art to support Andy's career for purely material reasons because they couldn't afford a space that had 2 studios, and she had to be the breadwinner and have a day job. When she came back to art in Calhoun, she started making self-portraits, which was interesting because the other famous Cindy from Buffalo, Cindy Sherman, is known for her self-portraits. So Cindy Suffoletto starts making self-portraits, but she would manipulate the images by Xeroxing them multiple times in a technique called xerography, which would change she would layer in backgrounds, layer in foregrounds, and then she would take organic found materials and put them on top of those to become these sort of self-portrait collages. Things like snakeskin or fish scales or dead bugs that she would find around the house. So totally different from Andy's cold, machined steel and glass works, but similarly experimental. Quickly, funny story about why Andy was driving and not flying. So the drive from Buffalo to New York City in bad traffic can be about 8 hours. In good traffic, maybe 6.5. The flight is 45 minutes. And when Andy was first going back and forth in the 80s, there was something called the People's Express, this airplane that could take you to New York for like $15. So you should fly. But Andy, at one point, was a contestant in a commission to design the concourse of the Buffalo airport. This would have been a huge deal for him in his career. He had other big moments, but this would have been a true breakthrough moment and a great homecoming for him as a Buffalo artist. It would be literally a bigger canvas than anything he'd ever worked on before. And he was one of 4 finalists. But like a lot of these art commissions, there's some politics involved. You don't necessarily have art curators or artists or collectors who are on the committee. There might be a few of them. You often have political plants. So in this case, there was a political plant. One of the city council members, a woman named Mary Martino, who was also a union boss. I mean, she was a pure politician. She was on the committee, and Andy had this design where he had mapped out the dates of the founding of the different locations around Buffalo, the little towns and villages, onto an actual map of the region, and then what the night sky looked like at the exact date that each one of these places was founded. And this, I think, also could have been played as music if it had been realized. Super far out there, but it was a beautiful design. Well, she looked at this, and she noticed that he had fit the map of the region into this like almond-like shape of the actual concourse. And she said, the outer harbor is in the wrong spot. And Andy heard this secondhand, and this was a real sticking point for her. And he said, well, I don't care if it's in the wrong spot. I made it into an almond to fit the concourse. Like, this is where I want it to be. If I move it here, it's going to throw everything else off. I'm not moving it. And one of his buddies on the commission said, look, she's the chair. She wants it moved. You got to move this thing. You're like a shoe-in to win this. You're the only one of the 4 finalists who's from Buffalo. And he's like, no, I'm not moving this thing. This is my design. And sure enough, he doesn't win. He was so mad about this that he never flew into Buffalo again. I mean, I think, honestly, the next time he flew into Buffalo was in a casket. So he drove the 6 to 8 hours every time after that. He was pretty stubborn, which is one of the factors that sometimes holds back artists from great success. I found that a lot of the artists who had great material success were much more pliable. Yeah. Yep?
When you finish writing the book, did you feel like you knew your aunt, or did you feel like you knew your aunt and uncle better, apart from just the art? Or was your relationship enhanced just by your research?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and I think it's tied to that last section I wrote. This book really kicked off because I felt, and I get into this in the documentary, but I gave my Aunt Cindy's eulogy. I was 19 years old, and it was a really brutal summer for our family. Within a span of 6 months, my Aunt Cindy died, her brother Dave died, and then my grandfather died. I think honestly because he saw his 2 kids go, and it was just brutal. And I gave all of their eulogies. And my family knew I wanted to be a writer, but what exactly does that mean? I'm 19 years old. It was my first experience of writing anything that actually mattered, and I could see its impact. But there's also for anybody who's had to participate in this weird ritual of writing an oratory, you may relate to this, but I at least experienced that after I gave the eulogy, family and friends would come up to me and say, "Oh, you did such a great job, you really brought Cindy back, you really captured her." And that made me feel like I did the opposite. It only made me realize more and more how little I really knew about her and her life. And that bugged me for about a decade. It was just sort of in the back of my mind, like, did I really, really know her? Did I really capture something that was true in that eulogy? And about 10 years after that, an envelope shows up at my other uncle's house, addressed from this name that nobody recognized, Eric Siegeltuck. And it contained all of these printed photographs of Andy and Cindy in Paris in the 80s. And we were all fascinated by this, and I had no idea that they'd ever been to Paris. I mean, I knew very little about their careers as artists. And that brought me back to that feeling that I had after giving the eulogy, where I felt, do I really know these people at all? And so I started investigating, and I started digging into it. And I do feel now that I know them far more intimately than I did when they were alive, because I was able to ask questions of their lives as an adult that I wasn't able to, as a teenager at 19. But also, writing the book has, in a way, been a kind of a way to continue a dialogue with them after their death. I actually feel like I was sort of collaborating with them, especially now that the book is out. I've become sort of unintentionally a steward of their estates in a way, certainly with respect to Cindy. And now I have collected a lot of their artwork. I get into this in the documentary, but I didn't know that Cindy ever returned to making art, except in kind of a casual way. We had a few oil paintings that she made when we cleaned out her house. But I found, in the midst of writing the book, that she had actually produced a body of 50 self-portraits in the last 4 years of her life. And I found pictures of her hanging them on the walls and other evidence that suggested she really intended to show those works and exhibit them with the same kind of ambition she had had as a 18, 19, 20-year-old in Buffalo, deciding to move to New York. And so I found them, I preserved them, I got them framed, and now I've been talking with galleries about exhibiting them. And it looks like there will be a pretty big exhibit in Buffalo across 2 galleries of those works in 2026. So that kind of ongoing work, continuing to engage with their art, has made it feel like I not only know them better, but that I still sort of know them now, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Is the eulogy in the book?
No. It's an interesting question. I chose not to reproduce the eulogy, partly because now I don't think it's all that impressive. I'm maybe even a little embarrassed of it, but I did think about it. I thought about putting it in the footnotes, and maybe I should have. Yeah. Well, I think maybe that's a good place to stop. I could certainly keep the conversation going over lunch or later tonight. Thank you again all for coming. I really appreciate it.